I hope you noticed the book strategically placed over my right-hand shoulder here, very discreetly, I thought, as a Zoom prop. I can claim it's my copy of Outsourcing Empire, Phillips and Sharman. So welcome, everyone. I'm your novice chair for today, Andrew O'Neill, for those of you who don't know me. And it's my great pleasure today to host Associate Professor Andrew Phillips, who will be known to almost all of you, I think, as one of our colleagues from across the river at the University of Queensland. Andrew's going to be talking to us today on the title Before Hegemony, How Rising Powers Prepare for System Domination. Quite a topical seminar, I dare suggest. I'll say a few brief words about Andrew, and then we'll then I'll hand the floor over to Andrew, who'll talk for about 35 minutes. So Andrew is an associate professor, as I say, in international relations and strategy in the School of Political Science and International Studies at UQ. Andrew's research focuses on historical and contemporary transformations of international orders. Andrew's most recent books include, with Christian Reus-Smit as co-editor, Culture and Order in World Politics through Cambridge University Press in 2020, with Jason Sharman, Outsourcing Empire, How Company States Made the Modern World, with Princeton University Press 2020, and I understand, Andrew, your forthcoming book with Cambridge University Press, How the East Was Won, Barbarian, Conquerors, Universal Conquest, and the Making of Modern Asia. So by any measure, an outstanding CV. Andrew, the floor's yours. Greatly looking forward to your presentation, so take it away, please.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you so much to everyone for attending. I want to begin with a brief anecdote. In the late 17th century, specifically the year 1683, in July of that year, in 1683, the Admiral Shi Lang helped to undertake the Qing conquest of Taiwan, in so doing extinguishing the last remnants of resistance to the expanding Manchu Empire and confirming the Qing dynasty as the dominant universal hegemons throughout Northeast Asia. A mere 2 months later, at the gates of Vienna, the Ottoman Empire, which at that point had been the greatest security threat to Europe, was defeated. The Siege of Vienna in 1683 inaugurated the progressive retreat of the Ottomans from Europe and ended a period in which they had threatened to dominate and even absorb the European state system. The reason I begin with these anecdotes that occurred in opposite ends of the Eurasian landmass in the late 17th century is really to try to dramatise a key puzzle that I'm seeking to explain in my current research, which is really the question, the puzzle of universal domination. How do we explain how in some international systems actors are able to dominate and even absorb international systems, whereas in other international systems, what we instead see is the prevalence of balancing dynamics and the preservation of a sovereign state system. By way of context, this is part of a project that I'm exploring with my long-term collaborator, Jason Sharman, but I'm also hoping to extrapolate from the historical insights that we're exploring to look at the contemporary international system as well. In the remaining minutes that I have available to me, what I'd like to do is to first outline the broad basics of the puzzle that I'm pursuing, and as is the convention in academia, to carve out a sufficiently self-serving gap in the literature. Second, I would like to offer the bare basics of the theoretical framework that Jason and I are currently working on to explain universal domination in early modern Eurasia, and in particular to offer a couple of historical vignettes to illustrate that. And third, what I'd like to do, and I admit in this context, doing it really not so much as kind of a trial run and in a fairly tentative tone, is to try to extrapolate from the historical insights that we've been exploring to try to get a sense of how they might apply to great power competition in the current context. So to begin in terms of the puzzle of domination seeking in international relations, this is a project that really came from the intuition that if we look at the international system and the narrative as typically dominated much of international relations scholarship. This is essentially a narrative that emphasises the irreducible pluralism of the European state system, and more broadly emphasises the prevalence of balancing behaviours in world politics. So to the extent that international relations scholars engage with insights from history at all, it typically tends to be very Eurocentric, and it typically tends to follow a story that emphasises the likelihood that would-be conquerors are eventually thwarted through the emergence of a countervailing coalition. And indeed, to engage the stylised story that is often provided in accounts of the evolution of the international system, what we see is that this is a story in which the road is littered with failed would-be conquerors of Europe, beginning with Charles V in the 16th century, progressing to Philip II, then subsequently Napoleon, Kaiser Bill in World War I, Hitler, and potentially Stalin as well. So the narrative here is one that suggests that in international politics, the more common tendency is that when you have an actor that seeks to dominate an international system, and in particular, when it is engaging in a systematic project of hard revisionism centred around military conquest that seeks to entirely dominate the regional neighbourhood, that it is likely to be thwarted, that actors are likely to be able to mobilise both internally and externally to resist that trend. Now, those of you who may have engaged with some of my other work will know that Eurocentrism is a continuing frustration of mine when it comes to the study of international systems. Accordingly, a fairly obvious point of departure for me is to suggest, well, what does the story look like from outside of Europe? And I'm hardly Robinson Crusoe in undertaking this form of inquiry. In fact, I'm indebted to scholars such as David Kang, Robert Kelly, Manjit Padesi, who's written some really terrific stuff on the Mughal Empire, and even Aisha Zarakol's latest work on the Ottoman Empire, who have turned our gaze outside of Europe and considered the puzzle of universal conquest from a more geographically expansive perspective. In particular, what is notable here is the tendency for unipolarity to predominate in Northeast Asia. But again, to offer some sympathetic critiques of this admirable effort to broaden our geographical horizon. The story of universal domination, to the extent that it is taken up outside of the context of early modern Europe, has very much fixated on this idea of very much region-specific kind of studies. So you've got the works I've already mentioned that David Kang and Robert Kelly have talked about the importance of Confucian cultural consensus in providing a basis for peaceful Sinocentric hegemony within the region. Victoria Tin-Bo Hui, whose sensibilities align theoretically more closely with mine, has written some really terrific work in the focusing on the warring states period in ancient Chinese history, in which we see a collection of feuding states eventually consolidate in the form of the Qin Empire. To me, these studies are instructive in that they suggest the tendency towards balancing is far from universal, and in fact, in other regions, the tendency towards universal domination is one that is much more prevalent. That said, one of the challenges in the literature at the moment is that it nevertheless doesn't provide us with an explanation as to why balancing dynamics might prevail in some contexts and universal domination will prevail in others. Tin-Bo Hui, in her I.O. article in 2004-2005 and her in an accompanying book, offers us the beginnings of such an explanation by contrasting the ancient warring states period in China with early modern Europe, in which balancing predominated. However, this still leaves the puzzle open in terms of if we look at this in the context of cases that are playing out contemporaneously. So this is the broad puzzle that I'd like to explore for the remainder of the presentation, focusing almost exclusively on historical cases, but then in the remaining minutes towards the end, teasing out some of the contemporary implications. So I should also flag the substance of much of what I'm about to say is distilled from a recent paper which I've written with Jason Sharman, and I'm realising that this is not a particularly helpful visual prop in the medium that I'm in, Anarchy or Empire, explaining polarity across international systems. And we really started off with this puzzle of why balancing in Europe and domination in East Asia. And that's really the central focal point that we've had of saying, well, if we're going to engage in the puzzle of domination seeking, it is helpful to engage the history, but to do so in a way that is comparative and that is contemporaneous in the focus that it looks at. That is, that these are dynamics that are playing out broadly at the same time. So to begin with, in terms of our theoretical framework, why is it that some domination seekers are able to consolidate a position of domination within a particular international system? We suggest that there are two factors that are causally primary in explaining this outcome. The first, and perhaps most obviously, is that in order to dominate an international system, a domination seeker needs to be able to acquire the military wherewithal, that is the combat capability needed to prevail over any conceivable combination of adversaries. Obviously, in different historical contexts, it can be a situation in which military innovations are either offence dominant or defence dominant. In the early modern period, and particularly the period that we look at in our paper, the 16th and the 17th century, we argue that there is a tendency towards offence dominance across the Eurasian landmass. The second element, though, and I'll explore these in greater detail in the cases themselves, the second element, which is at least as important to us, though, is the importance for would-be conquerors of being able to legitimise their conquests and therefore entice collaboration from target polities. And to break this down into greater detail, what we know from the balancing literature, in particular from the work of people like Stephen Walt and his followers, is the idea that often polities balance not simply against military capabilities, but they work on the basis of the balance of threat. This suggests that there is some scope for domination seekers within international systems to engage in forms of agile cultural statecraft, for want of a better phrase, in order to do two things. First, to forestall the emergence of a balancing coalition, to engage in cultural signalling in a way that makes them appear less threatening to the regions that they are targeting, and therefore encourage states to lower their guard. The second element, if they can do even better than that, is to use various strategies of legitimation to entice bandwagoning from polities that are targeted for conquest. So our argument is that if we are trying to explain the prevalence of domination seeking across early modern Eurasia, a useful place to start is to engage in looking at, okay, does a domination seeker exist? If so, do they have the military wherewithal capable of engaging in system-wide conquest? But do they also possess the cultural agility to be able to overcome what we call the legitimation gradient? That is, just as we can talk logistically about a loss of strength gradient, so too we can talk about a legitimation gradient. If you are conquering an adjacent regional international system, what are the existing obstacles in terms of cultural difference that you will need to neutralise in order to be able to forestall balancing and to encourage bandwagoning? And in the two primary cases that we look at, the Ottomans' near conquest of Europe and the Manchu successful conquest of East Asia, what we see are these dynamics playing out in ways that are very different, but in that variation, hopefully useful in giving us a sense in terms of explaining the prevalence of universal conquest within international systems. So the first case that I want to explore now in greater detail is the case of the Ottomans' failed conquest of Europe. Now, this point of departure might initially seem quite counterintuitive. If we look at most studies of the European international system as it evolved, to the extent that they focus on the concern of universal conquest at all, they typically look at challenges that emerged from within the European context. In the context of the 16th century in particular, they focus on the rise of the Habsburgs and the challenge presented by Charles V. However, Speaking against that, if we actually look at what's happening in this part of the world in the late 15th, early 16th century, it becomes evident quite clear that the Habsburg challenge was relatively ephemeral in its challenge to the the embryonic European state system. In particular, we see a split between the Spanish and Austrian lines of the Habsburg house by about 1555. Conversely, the Ottomans present as a persistent, powerful threat to Europeans that come very close to absorbing Europe and subjecting it to a form of universal rule. By way of context, if we're looking at the rise of the Ottomans, they are one of the most potent Eurasian domination seekers in the early modern period. By the time we get to the early 16th century, they have conquered all of Anatolia, including Constantinople, erstwhile capital of what remained of the Eastern Roman Empire. They have extended their hegemony deep into the Balkans, in addition having conquered the Middle East, and particularly having captured the most holy Muslim cities of Mecca, Medina and Jerusalem, as well as projecting significant maritime power into the Eastern Mediterranean, into the Red Sea and even into parts of the Indian Ocean. So in terms of their geographic reach, they were very significant. More generally, speaking to the theoretical elements of our argument, the Ottomans succeeded in generating potentially system-beating military capabilities. They failed, however, in overcoming the legitimation gradient necessary in order to undertake universal conquest in Europe. And I'll very briefly, and I'm happy to speak in Q&A to the specifics of the argument, but what Jason and I have argued is that if we're looking at early modern Eurasia, rather than focusing on a European-centred military revolution, which is what Geoffrey Parker and a number of other specialists in this area have focused on, what we instead suggest is that what's notable in this period is a Eurasian military synthesis, in which those actors that were typically most successful in conquest were able to combine the shock and speed of cavalry warfare with the firepower revolution that had come with the advent of gunpowder technologies and the emergence of massed infantry. Now, the Ottomans were extraordinarily successful in mastering this Eurasian military synthesis. They were precocious military innovators. For example, through their Janissary military slave system, they were able to recruit, or rather conscript, large numbers of Europeans from the Balkans and to incorporate them into a conspicuously modern form of infantry-based warfare. At no point were they behind the Europeans militarily in terms of techniques until the 18th century onwards. And in fact, in both Vienna in 1529 and then again in 1683, they threatened to conquer Central Europe more generally. But where they did face a challenge is through this question of legitimation. Now, the story that's often told here is one that accents religious difference as being both necessary and sufficient to account for the Ottomans' defeat. Our argument acknowledges the importance of religious difference in raising the legitimation gradient in ways that made it very difficult for the Ottomans to succeed. But we are quite careful in the argumentation that we have deployed here. Specifically, our argument is that if you look at the progress of Ottoman conquest in the Balkans in the 15th century, even in the conquest of Constantinople, prior to the early 16th century, religious difference per se is not an impediment to continuing Ottoman conquest, continued Ottoman ability to secure the collaboration of locals. What changes, though, is that from the 16th century, and this is a story that is all too often overlooked in many accounts of the Ottoman conquest, from the early 16th century onwards, the Ottomans are highly successful not only in conquering Europe, but also in parts of the Middle East as well. In defeating the Mamelukes in the early 16th century, they come to occupy the holy cities of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, Al-Quds. At the very same time, they are also fighting it out for a position of dominance in the Middle East versus Safavid Persia. The significance of this is that as a result of these conquests in the Middle East, the Ottomans increasingly emphasise the centrality of Islam in their legitimation strategies. At the very same time, in Europe, the impact of the Reformation has sharpened people's religious sensibilities, has seen the emergence of counter-Reformation zeal on the part of the House of the Habsburgs, in ways as a result of what is really quite a serendipitous conjunction of factors, of sharpening that level of religious animosity in a way that then helps to encourage balancing against the Ottomans. We see, as a result, by the time we get to 1683, the emergence of the Holy League, which is an explicitly religious Christian balancing coalition to defeat the Ottoman conquest at that point. Incidentally, that then gives the Europeans sufficient time to be able to militarily innovate to hold back subsequent efforts at Ottoman conquest. If we shift our focus then from the Ottomans in the Middle East and Europe to East Asia, what we see is a very different story when it comes to the Manchus. These are a force that are systematically stigmatized in early modern Northeast Asia as being seen as barbarians that are innately inferior to the Han-ruled Ming dynasty. And yet, beginning in the 1590s and culminating with the fall of the Ming dynasty in 1644, the Manchus are able to undertake universal conquest. Our explanation here is that, like the Ottomans, the Manchus are very adept military innovators. They are extraordinarily successful in combining the strengths of steppe-based cavalry warfare with the use of infantry and gunpowder weaponry initially purloined from China. In addition, though, there are characteristics of the international system that they are expanding into that actually work to favour universal conquest in ways that are absent in the Ottoman case. So you recall in the Ottoman case that the timing of Ottoman conquests in the Middle East leads them to sharpen their Islamic legitimation claims in a way that helps them to consolidate their rule in the Middle East, but also enhances the likelihood of balancing behaviours from the Europeans, thereby thwarting attempts at universal domination. Contrast this with the case in Northeast Asia. And what is notable in this period in time is that the Manchus should be seen as unlikely universal conquerors, not least because they have been stigmatised as barbarians that are therefore positioned extraordinarily low, indeed at the bottom of the East Asian civilizational hierarchy. What changes we suggest is that on the one hand, you've got extremely adept cultural statecraft on the part of the Manchus. They are, as Pamela Crosley and other champions of the new Qing history talk about, they are cultural chameleons par excellence. As a result of their efforts to secure the cooperation of defecting Chinese scholar administrators, they are capable of undertaking what Aisha Zarakol has talked about as a strategy of correction. Drawing herself on the work of the sociologist Irving Goffman, she suggests that one approach to overcoming stigma is to engage in behaviours of correction that enable you to pass for the more civilised actor and therefore lower their inhibitions towards being subject to conquest. And this is precisely what the Manchus do. The advantage that they have is that the Confucian vision of essentially what is a Confucian civilizing mission is importantly divorced from conceptions of ethnic proprietorship. That is, put less fancily, anyone, Han or non-Han, can potentially claim the mandate of heaven. So if we observe the process of Manchu conquest in the period of the 17th and indeed into the 18th centuries, what is significant about that process of conquest is that they are able to tailor their legitimation strategies in a way to overcome tendencies towards balancing and indeed to encourage a process of bandwagoning. I do not have scope in the remaining portion of this presentation to get into the broader details of how the Manchus then extend their reach beyond the core 18 provinces of China to also conquering the steppe as well. But what I do want to suggest is that one of the innovations that we try to make in this argument is that the literature in international relations persistently treats China as a timeless and eternal unit rather than a system. Part of our argument, though, is to suggest that if we look at what is now encompassed by China, what we actually see is that this is actually an international system rather than simply a single state. So that's it by way in terms of some of the historical elements that we've tried to explore in this. To recap some of the key elements of the argument, what we're trying to explain is the puzzle of universal domination. In the early modern context, we suggest that this is the result of an ability to master offensive military technologies in the form of the Eurasian military synthesis, and an ability to also overcome a legitimation gradient through agile forms of cultural statecraft that facilitate frustrating balancing while enabling and indeed encouraging a degree of bandwagoning. In terms of some of the broader historical specifics of this, in my forthcoming book, which according to Amazon is coming out 2 weeks from now, I also extend this analysis to looking at the British conquest of South Asia. Again, we see very similar dynamics there. The British are extremely canny at crafting their legitimation strategies to reduce tendencies towards balancing. They also have the advantage of drawing on the world's largest market for mercenaries in India. To the extent that the British have a signature military advantage, it actually comes in the form of their more sophisticated systems of mobilising war credit. They are able to raise larger sums of money, and they are therefore able to outspend and outlast their opposition. But there are very similar dynamics that are at play in all of these different cases. So what does this mean then for those of us, which really includes probably the vast majority of political science and international relations scholars who have no interest in early modern Eurasia, who have no interest in any of the history, but simply want to get a sense of how this plays out in dynamics of system domination today. And this is really where my comments will be at their most tentative and where I am most keen to get the collective wisdom of the room. But to begin with a couple of prefatory observations. If we're talking about this question of system domination, there are certainly critical changes that have occurred within the international system, really in the past 70 years in particular, that very significantly inhibit the ability of actors to engage in hard forms of revisionism, system domination in the true classical sense that we look at, that I've looked at in the cases that I've mentioned. What's notable about early modern Eurasia is a confluence of two tendencies. The first, as flagged, the rise in the form of a Eurasian military synthesis of offensive dominant forms of military innovation. The second, which we get into a little bit in the paper, is a legacy of the conquests of Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, which is that ideals of universal conquest have a significant degree of cross-regional purchase throughout most parts of Eurasia in the period from the really from the 14th to the 19th century. Contrast that with the contemporary period. I think what is notable in the international system today are really two things. The first is, and I'm very happy to be challenged and indeed educated on this point, but my layperson's reading of it is that what we see in the international system today is a series of military technologies that significantly preclude efforts at territorial conquest. First, at the most basic level, when we're talking about competition between peer competitors, there is, of course, the existence of mutually assured destruction through nuclear deterrence, something which has no historical analogies and which therefore presents a problem in terms of states that seek to conquer potential peer competitors. As an addendum to that, we also have seen in the rise of subconventional insurgent guerrilla warfare in the past 100 years, the emergence of strategies that effectively enable popular military mobilisation in ways that frustrate universal conquest. So this would seem to suggest that if if system domination is to occur in the modern international system, it's going to look very different to what it looked like in the past. Again, to flag some of the other key systemic differences we have seen in the past century, in particular with the universalisation of a sovereign state system, the spread of nationalism, and also the consolidation of norms of territorial exclusivity. So this would suggest then that if we're trying to make sense of what a system dominating strategy would look like in the contemporary context, we need to shift the language away from puzzles of universal conquest towards something different. In the concluding minutes, what I really want to do is just sort of sketch a few very brief ideas that I've had in terms of what system domination might look like in the contemporary international context. And by contemporary, because I am someone who is veritably obsessed with historical international relations, I've got a pretty broad definition of contemporary, really looking at the last 150 years. So the first thing that I'd note is that if we're examining the prospect of system domination today, we are likely to see it less as a strategy of overt and unapologetic conquest, and more as a strategy that I've described as hide, bide, and build. So this is a strategy that would involve, in the first instance, exploiting the economic openness of the existing international order in order to build one's economic and military capabilities. There is a veritable tradition of this strategy in East Asian statecraft. The concept of self-strengthening has a very strong genealogy. Indeed, Eric Helleiner has just written a terrific article talking about the developmental state as being something that derives largely from East Asian history rather than being a Western import. But what I'd suggest is that for a would-be system dominator, one of the opportunities that the international system presents today is the fact that you have a degree of economic openness that enables a state to potentially build its capabilities to import and acquire the economic basis that is necessary to subsequently mount a systemic challenge. Incidentally, there are important historical precedents for this. If we look, for example, at the Manchu conquest, they were able to build capabilities in part through exploiting the commercial porousness of their border with China, through exploiting the Chinese demand for ginseng as a means of developing a war chest that then enabled them to undertake conquest. So the first phase would be one of exploiting economic openness to build one's economic and military capabilities. The second is what I call a strategy of dissimulation, and that is the idea of a strategy of predatory conformity to the norms of the existing system as a means of maximising gains while minimising the likelihood of an early attempt at balancing. So this is a strategy of dissimulation that is likely to be most effective in international systems in which the prevailing normative architecture of that system is characteristically cosmopolitan, universalistic, and inclusive. And again, to leverage some of the historical examples and to try to translate them into a contemporary context. With the Manchus, as we've seen, the very openness of Confucianism, the very fact that Confucianism claimed universal application, the very claim that Confucian civilization could help to uplift and civilize barbarians, enabled the Manchus a toehold, enabled them to dissimulate in a way that helped them to ascend within that international system. Likewise, I'd suggest that the liberal international order today, as weak and faltering as it might be, potentially provides hegemonic challenges with the opportunity to dissimulate, with the opportunity to appear to conform while nevertheless building up their capabilities and getting ready to mount a more serious challenge against that system. In many respects, this is actually a riff on the earlier literature that talked about the ability of the liberal international order to socialise states into compliance. I'd suggest that that very conceit that rising powers can be socialised, in fact, provides an opportunity for rising powers to dissimulate and to appear as if they are being socialised while further building their capabilities. The third element would be the development of exclusive patron-client networks, particularly leveraging growing commercial and particularly merchandise trading centrality as a means of doing this. And the fourth, finally, and this is leveraging off the terrific book that Kai Hare and his colleagues have written recently on contesting revisionism, the idea of a strategy of institutional competition, of competitive order building, that is creating an institutional frame that will enable a state to acquire system domination not through old school territorial conquest, but rather through progressively hiding, biding and building a counter-international order to displace and eventually replace the existing order. Now, if it sounds like I am conceiving this contemporary iteration with the China case in mind, that is partially true, but what I'm most interested in exploring in the next step of this project is actually exploring a comparison between China's ability to manage its rise within the contemporary international system with the role of the United States in the 19th century. The United States in the 19th century, I think, actually provides a really interesting case of an actor that parasitically exploited the openness and cosmopolitanism of a British liberal hegemonic order in order to bide its time, build its capabilities, and eventually, in the context of the 20th century, to claim a position of hegemonic leadership. I confess I've had an enormous amount of coffee today, and I have been spitting out mad rhymes trying to actually get some of these ideas onto paper. I'm going to pause there, having tested your patience, and throw it back to Andrew to chair from here on in. Thanks a lot for your patience, nevertheless.
Thanks, Andrew. There's an awful lot of rich food for thought in all of that. I'm particularly intrigued by your sort of closing historical analogy there that I'm sure some colleagues will take up in the discussion period. So as your novice chair, what I propose is that if you have a question or comment for Andrew, if you could signal that by raising your hand.